Hi, everybody. Hello. Welcome. Welcome to the Internet Privacy and Social Network Symposium, the first ever that in the library, the Lila D. Bunch Library, is partnering with Public Relations here at Belmont to put this on, and we're really excited about the programming we're going to bring you. Really proud to put this on. My name is Chuck Hodgel, so I'm a member of the library faculty here at Belmont. And just in case you don't know, the programming we've got for you today is from now till 11:30, Patrick Klepek of Kotaku.com, formerly of Giant Bomb, and other places, is going to talk about internet privacy. And then from 11:30 to 12:30, there will be a student panel discussion moderated by Dr. Kevin Trowbridge. He's a professor of public relations here, and some PR students are going to talk about similar issues, but what it's like for them as young professionals that have to put themselves out there online, but don't really. There's not any hard and fast rules about how to kind of draw the boundaries for security with that. So they'll be talking about those issues. But before we get to that, I just want to take a minute to thank some people whose contributions made the symposium possible. Library Director Dr. Ernest Hurd and Associate Provost Dr. Beverly Schneller. They really believed in the idea of the symposium from the beginning and have generously lent their support to us. Sue Mazzaros helped immensely in conceptualizing the idea for this whole thing. And Jessica Martin is not here because of her internship, but she was really instrumental in organizing the panel discussion and facilitating our relationship with PR. And of course, Dr. Kevin Trowbridge, who will be moderating. He enthusiastically agreed to this and has been all on board since we talked to him. We're really grateful that he was willing to be a part of this. And then they're not here, I don't think right now, but I just want to thank each of our panelists by name. Kramer Deans, Haley Hall, Emily Gaynor, Christina Royce, and Ryan Bukowski. Big thanks to them for volunteering their time and their effort today to help make this event happen. But now, it falls on me to introduce our speaker. Patrick Klepek has been covering the video game industry since he was 14 years old. He's done so for outlets such as G4 and MTV, most famously for Giant Bomb and most currently Kotaku.com. He is an advocate for women and minorities in the games industry, as well as someone pushing for the progress in how those groups are represented in games themselves. In recent years, he's begun to explore the discourse discourse in general on the internet, which has led him to write about topics that he'll be discussing today. Patrick has gained an audience not only by providing thoughtful insight, but by being open and honest with that audience. He lets us in. In YouTube video and podcast form, he tells us about his frustrations with Chicago Bears, or recounts stories of his unique family traditions. Patrick also opens up to us about the tragic passing of his father in 2013 and his dear friend Ryan 1 year later. He forms a personal connection with his audience, who sees him not primarily as a journalist or an internet personality, but as a friend. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Patrick Klepek.
I want those kind of compliments everywhere I go. Just wake up in the morning and I'm going to tell my wife, this is really useful. It gets me really pumped up for the day. Do that. So, well, I would introduce myself briefly, but thanks to Chuck for doing that. I want to thank Belmont for having me on. I want to thank everyone here for coming by, whether it's for extra credit or because you're genuinely interested. Either way is just fine. And it's my first time in Nashville, which has been really nice so far. The hotel I was staying at, I was trying to figure out where to eat, and then everyone had been recommending they want to go to Hattie B's Hot Chicken, and literally my hotel was next to the Hattie B's Hot Chicken. So I feel like that was like a it foretold that this was going to be a good event, and has made my brief stay in Nashville really nice. I'm going to have to talk to my wife about coming by soon. And what I'm looking to talk about today is essentially the world we live in now is one in which we slowly, over time, have ceded more and more of our privacy, in which we use social networks that make money off of us in exchange for using free services, whether it's Snapchat, Facebook, or Twitter, or Google search. All of these things want to know a little bit more about us, and by knowing more about us, by intruding on our privacy, by allowing us to open up more and share more, they can target ads at us in which they can make money. And so these services are really cool, though. And so I want to talk about what some of these services do, how some of this information can be used insidiously by folks that may want to use it against you on the internet, and just kind of things to be aware of that you might not think about when you use these social services, but how that stuff can sort of impact sort of like your digital footprint on the internet. And kind of what I want to point out is that I think we often think about stuff like this as impacting sort of public figures or celebrities or folks like that, but I want to walk through specific examples of folks that are everyday people that don't have a lot of people paying attention to what they do, and yet they found themselves becoming targets, and because of the digital footprint they left behind, we're able to be harassed both online and in person in ways that I think can be valuable lessons to all of us. Chuck gave a brief introduction. Like I said, I've been writing about games since I was 14. I was lucky enough to have really supportive parents that said, sure, you can write about video games, and I'm pretty sure they thought that that just wouldn't work out, and I continue to laugh as it continues to work out just okay. I think video games are really important. I think they're a cultural medium that will only become more important over time. It used to be something that I was sort of ashamed to say that, oh, I write about video games all day, but now it's something I'm proud of. I think not everyone considers themselves a gamer, but if you've played Candy Crush, if you've played Angry Birds, like you play video games. You play Farmville, you play video games. So I think games are something that are becoming more and more important to wider and wider audiences. And so to be part of a site like Kotaku, which is read by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people every single day, our website gets to be sort of at the forefront of the conversation of how we talk about games and what's important in games. And it's been incredibly humbling to be a part of that as my career has gone on. So privacy. So, I think, a lot of what we talk about with privacy is, we talk about the Edward Snowden leaks, right? We often think of privacy in the context of intrusion from the outside, from the government, surveillance, drones. Like, we tend to think it's an intrusion on us that we don't welcome or that we haven't signed off on. And I think most people, if you were to ask them, like, oh, is privacy important to you? Most people would probably tell you that it is. But I think there is enough trends, both what I've noticed in my real life and what I have found by researching and reading studies, is that what people say in public is often very different what they do in private or how they actually act. We often act as though privacy is something that is, in our top 10 most important things, but as it turns out, it's really not all that important. And we're actually doing a really good job of allowing people to track us in a way that can be used for nefarious means. So I want to start like really basic, explaining kind of like what I mean by this concept. And so it's passwords. We all have passwords. And all of your passwords are terrible. Like I can say that with like pretty decent amount of confidence that most of the passwords out here are probably pretty bad because they're annoying. Like they're a pain in the butt. Like you have to come up with new ones for each website. And like I guess you're adding numbers to it to try and make it unique. And we all know probably what we should be doing with passwords and how we should probably be doing more about them. But we don't. And to sort of illustrate just how bad this has gotten over the years, there's a company called Splash Data that annually publishes the worst passwords from the previous year. And the way they generate this list is when passwords are leaked. You might have heard that like Target had a big intrusion last year, and there were credit card companies that had big intrusions. This happens all the time. Our passwords are leaked onto the internet. They're sold on black markets so that people can use that to cash in on credit cards. And what Splash Data does is they download all of this data and then look for patterns. They try and understand what are people actually doing with their passwords that they aren't saying publicly. And so I want to run through the list of the top 10 worst passwords. And the way they come up with this is that they didn't just pick, well, these are just the worst because we think they're funny. These are the top 10 most common passwords that people were using based on the leaked data. So football is number 10, which, I mean, I guess you could add 2 zeros, and maybe that might be a little bit better. Dragon, which is a cool password, but not a particularly useful one. Baseball, which I guess I thought football would have been higher. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. You're going to notice a pattern with those top ones, which becomes a habit with people when they think they're coming up with a clever way of doing their passwords. So we'll transition over to 5, 4, and 3, which again, variations on numbers, which if you just went in a different order, that would be a step, that would be an improvement. But then that's also, we'd have to remember that, right? Like, we're going to write down our passwords. Like, that's where the problem comes in, is that even though passwords are powerful and we know that they can help us, like, they're a pain. It's, if you have a recent iPhone, or, it's kind of nice that you don't type in your password because you hold your thumb on it. And that's basically technology companies trying to find ways for us to have a password that isn't reliant on us actually remembering a password. Because as we get to the last 3, I mean, it continues to be embarrassing. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's only 5 numbers, right? Like, at least the other ones went up to 0. Password, also a very, very common password, that's bad. That's just no effort whatsoever. You just saw the word password and typed it in because it was there. It is easy though, so I'll at least try to do that. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which it just, again, it shows the commonality of a lot of these. And one of the things I would implore you is just a very basic step is to look at your passwords, realize that they're probably all terrible, and just take some basic steps. What's nice is that there are a lot of tools out there that do make this easier. There's an application called 1Password that just stores all of your passwords, and it generates new ones for you. Just click a button, and it makes these really long, complicated passwords, but you don't need to remember them. You just type in 1Password for 1Password, and then it spits it out into your website or anything like that. And if you're college students, you don't want to spend money, there's another one called LastPass that does the exact same thing, and then it's completely free. You may not have to either of those things, but just look at your passwords, just realize that you probably have terrible ones, and just at least add some numbers or an exclamation mark. Like, that stuff goes a long way, because your passwords are going to get leaked. Your passwords are going to get stolen, and your passwords are going to be shared in shadier corners of the internet. That is a constant. That happens all the time. And it's one of the most common ways that information then starts getting passed around. So you think about it, when your password gets leaked, if someone decides to use that to log into, let's say, your Target account, well, on your Target account, it's going to have your shipping address. It's going to have your billing address. It's going to have other information about you. And as I'll illustrate further, when you take just a couple pieces of those information, it's very easy to punch them into other parts of the internet and start generating profiles about who you are and what you do in ways that would probably make a lot of us uncomfortable. So GPS, which saves my butt on a daily basis because I just can't do directions, it's just not my thing. I couldn't do it before GPS, and now whatever part of my brain maybe could have gotten better for that is now completely decimated by the fact that I can just follow a map program. And it's really useful, right? It gets us where we're going, and it gets us there faster, and we don't have to think about it. But the rise of GPS is also the rise of sort of location tracking, right? So you'll notice in most applications that you use now, you can kind of tag where you are. You can check in at a place. And that stuff sounds really cool on paper. This idea that you can let people know where you are, and you can kind of have a history of what you did that weekend. And all this stuff sounds really neat, but we have to take that in the context that these companies make money off that data. And they make money off that data by us doing it publicly. I would guess that most people in this audience, most of your social network accounts are public, and they aren't private, and you don't really look at the privacy settings, because again, like passwords, it's a pain in the butt. But as we start to look at how you leave a digital footprint and the stuff that you leave behind when you engage with these services, and it's not so much about not using location data, it's about smartly using location data and making sure you know where you're leaving it and why you're leaving it. So we can kind of start, this begins with Foursquare. Foursquare is not really a thing anymore, but Foursquare was essentially the social network that started the idea of check-in. You could check into a restaurant, if you did it enough times, you became the mayor. And you didn't get anything for that, but hooray, you're the mayor of Starbucks. They started this, and then everyone else started adopting the idea. And so Foursquare made us comfortable or excited about the idea of letting people know where we were and doing this in a public way. And for most people, it's not that big of a deal. But what we started to realize as we thought about the fact that we're sharing all this publicly, is like, well, how can that data be construed in ways that would probably bother us? And so there was a website started very much to make this point. It was called Please Rob Me. And so the concept of Please Rob Me was not to facilitate people robbing other folks and encouraging stalking or anything of that nature. But what Please Rob Me did was use this as an example. So this is someone's check-in from Foursquare, and they blurred out their name and their address, but they literally just made a check-in that was their house and called it their house. And you know, it's very easy to shake your head at this, but if you go to any of these applications and just search around you, you're going to find people's apartments. You're going to find references to people where they check in. And so what Please Rob Me was trying to sort of get across was that when you make a check-in for your apartment where you live, when you check in at the movie theater, you're sending the red flag that, you know, you're not at your place. And so if someone wanted to be malicious, all they have to do is pay attention to a little of that data, and then, you know, you could have a real problem on your hand. And then, you know, kind of their mission statement on their website was, the data not home. So here we are, on one end we're leaving lights on when we're going on a holiday, but on the other we're telling everyone on the internet we're not home. It gets even worse if you have friends who want to colonize your house. That means they have to enter your address to tell everyone where they are, your address on the internet. Now you know what to do when people reach for their phone as soon as they enter your home. That's right, slap them across the face. So it's sort of like this cheeky way of saying, like, look, like this stuff's cool, but we need to be using it responsibly. And you know, I found myself having to be that jerk sometimes when people were entering my house. It's like, you know, I have 100,000 followers on Twitter. I cannot have my address being blasted out in a way that people can easily discover. Like, chances are nothing's going to happen, but you never know. And so you'd have people coming in and like trying to check in, and it's like, I'm going to take your phone and stop you from doing that. And it's one of those things that I became aware of very early in the sense that, you know, I was cultivating a following on Twitter, and that was becoming very integral to my career. But, you know, I guess what I would argue is that although I'm on a more extreme end on that, and celebrities and folks who are more popular than me are on a more extreme end of that, like, in essence, because all of these social networks are encouraging us to share things publicly in exchange for these services, we are all public figures. We just don't think of ourselves in that context. When we don't think of ourselves in that context, it leads us to not be as concerned about some of this stuff as maybe we should. So when I was thinking about what I was going to talk about when I came down here, Chuck, who helped put together this, was he passed along a comment from a faculty member who said, so I was speaking to some colleagues about your impending arrival. One of them playfully remarked that she was going to Google you to see what you looked like. I told her it wouldn't be difficult because there are a million pictures of you on the internet. Pics of you at parties, pictures of you proposing to your wife. She was a bit taken aback that you, the man coming to talk about internet privacy, would have so many photos of yourself online. Which is true. I mean, I don't know what, you can't see this totally well, but I don't know, Kristen Bell and Andy Samberg are not me, but there are a lot of photos of me when you just do the Google image search for my name. You know, I am someone that has been able to benefit from sort of putting themselves out there. As Chuck mentioned, that's kind of what a lot of us are doing now, is putting ourselves out there. And, you know, I do that to more of a degree, but, you know, I would argue that, you know, you could probably punch in a lot of our names into a Google image search and you would come up with stuff. And you might be surprised at what you can punch in and discover about yourself, in which you leave, you know, little places all around, and then that all adds up into sort of a picture of who you are and what you've done. So, you know, Facebook, Instagram, Google, you know, these are sort of social networks that, you know, sort of encourage us to you think of privacy in a way that is a little more public than we have thought in the past. And what I want to transition to is where this information can then be used in a way of painting sort of a more specific picture of who you are. You know, one piece of information doesn't tell the whole story, but how do you use that one piece of information to tell a bigger story? So this is a website called Spokio. It looks like, you know, those people are embracing. They look like they might be two friends that are, you know, haven't seen each other in a while. Like this, they seem happy. But if you notice on there, the search options are name, email, phone, username, address. And so what Spokio does, and it's just one of a number of different websites that does this, is that you put in one piece of information you know about a person, and then it scrapes the whole internet to find out everything else they can. So for example, if you use your email associated with one service, you've probably used that with a bunch of other services. And depending on how much of that information is public, that allows them to very quickly just do a search and then paint a digital picture of who you are, what you've done, where you've lived, what your cell phone number might be, and a bunch of other information that would probably made me uncomfortable as soon as I realized that it was out there. I've spent a lot of time taking that stuff down. That is sort of the key takeaway, is that it's critical that you put in your information that you know, and then you go through these websites, and there's always kind of little tabs that are like, well, gee, if you don't want this here, I guess you can have it taken down. And you just do that for a couple of these different websites, and hopefully you start to bring some of your digital footprint back. But for example, with me, I punched this in last night, and this is what it came up for me, the stuff that I've left up. Yes, I live in San Francisco, LA, and Arlington Heights. The address that pulls up there is for the last place I lived in San Francisco. I don't know how they get that information. My guess is that because when you sign a lease, it goes into a government database, which would then allow, something like the phone book to exist, right? So you could find someone in a phone book. But it's one thing when you have to track a phone book down in a big physical thing, because none of us do that anymore. But when that data exists somewhere online, and then a website like Spokio can just crawl through it and pull it up, suddenly they have my address. Now, I leave that one up there because if someone's trying to look for me, maybe they just think that's where I live, and it's not, so I don't live there anymore. So one of the tactics I use is to leave incorrect data up there as a means of kind of like throwing people off the trail. But Nancy Klepek's my mother, Benjamin Klepek is my uncle, and as soon as I started discovering stuff like this, I started putting in other names of people close to me and just realizing how much of their stuff was out there, and slowly trying to take as much of it down as possible. There's another website called Pitbull. And this one's creepy because it generates like a PDF report of you. And it pulls up all this information about you that is even more specific. So at the bottom, 750 O'Farrell, that's another place I lived in San Francisco. Again, I assume they got it from a government database, but I don't know. I don't know how that got there, but all they did was punch in and pull that up. And then you have this like very friendly, this looks like really innocuous and looks like it might be useful. And I guess if you were trying to track a friend down, there are ways in which this could be used in a positive manner, but I think it's a lot easier to think of ways that it could be used in much uglier manners. And so I assume the career stuff is pulled from LinkedIn, a service that I don't even know why I signed up for in the first place. But it has all my career information. And I don't know where I got that username from, but I assume from somewhere. And it's a correct username that I've used in the past. And so, stuff like this just sort of illustrates not only that these websites can find this information, but are able to package them in a way that the average person can use and distribute in ways that you might not like. And so what happens is I end up, like every couple of months, I go to these websites, I figure out what information is out there that makes me uncomfortable, request to have it taken down, and then sort of have to do that every couple of months. Because what happens is that you sort of suppress the information on one website, and then it pops up on another. So like passwords and anything else, it is a huge pain, but I think it's easy to see how this might be useful in the long run. The other thing that always makes me laugh is the Instagram photo map, which is sort of on by default for most people. And GPS is really accurate these days. And I think if you were to go to your photo map, you'd realize you've probably taken a lot of photos of your dog or your cat or your friends over at a party. And essentially you have a whole history of the apartment that you are at with a little pin that points to directly where you are. And that little pin is very easy to look at and start guessing addresses that you can punch into these other services. And so it's not hard to see where we take an innocuous photo of our dog, which then is pinned to a map that is probably public because we haven't looked at our privacy settings, and then that makes it very easy for someone to put that into a website like Spokio and determine who you are and find out all sorts of other information about you. So it's this thing where we don't think about these individual instances, but when you start adding them up, it creates a lot of evidence and ammunition that can be used in ways that, like I said, would probably make us uncomfortable if we became aware of the full scope of what was out there. So what I want to talk specifically about then is okay, well, we talk about this in an abstract concept, where are instances in which this stuff is actually employed, and how is it used in a context that applies to sort of an average person. So in video games, there's a thing that's been going on for the last 8 months or so. It's this thing called Gamergate. It's a pretty dumb name for a movement that's going on since about last August. And I'll catch up very briefly. The reasons behind it are not that important, but I want to provide a little bit of context. So there was a game designer named Zoe Quinn who made a game with a team called Depression Quest. And essentially it was a sort of text-based thing where you chose a bunch of different paths and you essentially got to know what it was like to live the day of someone who actively experienced depression, to have a better understanding of the mood swings and things like that. And it was meant as a tool for folks that don't experience depression to have a better understanding of what that life is like. And this game attracted a lot of attention because it came at this moment in which there was a discussion over what are video games. You know, I think often we think of games, we think on one spectrum Candy Crush, on another spectrum Call of Duty. And there was this big influx happening amongst video game fans, like, what is the definition of a video game? And this idea that a thing that was based in text that helped you understand depression was not a video game because you didn't carry a gun, because there wasn't a game over screen. And so this game became a lightning rod and had attracted a lot of harassment for the creator, Zoe Quinn. And then in August, an ex-boyfriend of hers published a long screed essentially outlining a bunch of allegations about her sex life that wasn't, you know, any of our business, and implying that she had traded sexual favors for positive coverage of her game in the media. The sex stuff, not our business, and the stuff about the media was immediately debunked as untrue. And yet, what ensued was this public debate about what video games are, and this conversation that was happening in games was about how, you know, more women want to see themselves in games, and that, you know, there should be less sexist portrayals of women in games. Like, all like pretty, I think, like reasonable conversations to have, but in a community in which the demographics of games had so heavily catered to a certain type, this became hostile to that group. And so I set all of that up to explain what happened when this Gamergate thing ensued. It got this name from the actor Adam Baldwin. And he just coined that term, and then it became this hashtag that's been trending ever since. And when people have spoken out against Gamergate, primarily, you know, women and minorities, people of color, saying that they disagree with this notion that games can't be for everyone and can't be more inclusive and can't have more women in it, they would become targets. And the way they become targets is through all the stuff that I just outlined, in which you'd have everyday people that just happen to say, I disagree with Gamergate, and then they'd go and track down their information. And what they specifically do is a thing called doxing. So doxing, this is kind of the funny way of thinking of it, if you hate them, post their contact info. And so what happens is that folks that would speak out against Gamergate, and again, these people that just have a couple of followers that, you know, are not notorious, that don't wield a lot of social power and capital, people would then go and track down their Instagram, their Facebook, and they'd use that information, and they'd punch it into Spokio, and then they would use their home addresses and their cell phone numbers as a harassment tactic. And you can imagine if you saw someone, a stranger, randomly just saying, like, I know what your address is, and then pasting it, like, that would be terrifying. Doesn't mean that person's going to do anything, but it's the veiled threat using public information that's not hard to track down, using social services that we all sort of engage with, that allowed for a silencing tactic in which someone just wanted to express an opinion. And as a result of doing that, someone tried to silence them by using their public information. And so I think it's things like that that we need to consider, because you may not, you know, ever talk or care about Gamergate, but there may be some other issue that you decide to speak up on. There may be some other issue that you feel very strongly about and want to say something publicly about because you have a lot of conviction behind it. And that if you haven't considered where this other stuff comes in and plays, you know, again, sort of into your digital footprint, that there are ways that people can silence you. Because I don't blame anyone for seeing their home address plastered in their face and then saying, like, this isn't worth it. I don't want to talk about this anymore. And that's really damaging because we lose voices in the process. We lose out on interesting insight and conversations because these sort of bullying tactics allow people to use very personal information in a way that shouldn't be used this way, and yet is very effective at doing so. And this isn't really limited to games. I mean, you know, it happens also with a context, but, you know, I come at it through the video game industry because this is what I cover, and this is what I've seen. And the other one that's really horrifying is a thing called swatting. So swatting is this escalation of harassment that the best analogy I've been able to find is that if you used to crank call people, or if you used to like use like a soundboard, like when you call someone and just like say like funny lines from like Arnold Schwarzenegger, I think something like that, what the internet has allowed is an escalation of these sort of passive harassment tactics in which you can potentially do a lot of damage with no consequences to yourself. And so what happens with swatting is that people call in an anonymous tip about a crime in the hopes that the SWAT team will invade that person's house. And so this often happens when people are playing video games live. And so the fun, quote unquote, for the people who are instigating the swatting is that hopefully the SWAT team breaks in on the person while they're playing the video game live. So I'm going to play a short clip.
Uh-oh, this isn't good. They're clearing rooms. What in the world? I think we're getting swatted. I think we're getting swatted. What in the world?
What's your name?
So this happens, more commonly than you would think. And in this instance, this was somebody who was relatively well known. And if you are a public figure, one of the things I've had to do is to go to the police and let them know, hey, if someone calls and says that I murdered my wife, here's my cell phone number, could you call and verify that I did or didn't do that? And that's terrifying, but it's also the truth, right? Because as much as I go out of my way to try and figure out, what I've done or where I've got footprints, I spend a lot of time on the internet, and so I don't know where people are going to track down stuff, or maybe they track down stuff that my wife tagged that for some reason I didn't catch. That stuff happens, and so I'm then forced to tell the police that, yeah, I don't know why someone on the internet would want to say I murdered people that I spoke to, Max and Victoria Zeisberg. And so they're this instance of a couple that no one was paying attention to. They liked to stream games online to an audience because they both loved video games. It was something they shared together, and with the new video game machines, it's very easy to share it online. You literally just click a button, and then a camera pops up, and your game starts going out, and people can watch. And they did that just because it was fun. They weren't doing it because they wanted to make a career out of it. They weren't doing it because they got something out of it. They literally, all they got out of it was just kind of sharing a love for games, and they would see that 7 people were watching because they probably got there by accident. And it was that's just kind of cool that 7 people are enjoying what we do and sharing our love for video games. And so what happened with them was that in the chat room, they suddenly saw a spike. A spike for them is going from 7 to 15 people. That's a big deal. That's why are 15 people watching us play Call of Duty? This doesn't make any sense. They started seeing in the chat people using some really vulgar language and starting to drop links to Victoria's website. Now, Victoria was an insurance agent, and so as an insurance agent, she wants her information out there so that if people want insurance, they call her. So they tried to be careful on what they were sharing when they were streaming, but at one point or another, they mentioned their last name, and then someone took that last name, they punched it into Google. Google brought up her insurance website. Her insurance website had her cell phone number. Her cell phone number was then plugged into some of the websites that I had put up before. The cell phone number brings up her home address, and then the home address allowed an anonymous person on the internet to call into the local police and try and instigate a swatting. So this person called, and this is from the official police dispatch. This is kind of what the police were thinking at the time based on the information they had. While holding perimeter, Central Dispatch was attempting to call the male caller online, where he had called in on the non-emergency administration phone line and was stating his name is Max Ziegler. So, he got the name wrong up front, but that didn't matter. The cops let him take it seriously. He then stated he was sitting in his bedroom and wanted officers to come in. He told dispatch he was a current heroin user and that he had used heroin earlier in the day. He then stated that he'd used an AR-15 rifle to kill his wife, and he knew the cops were going to start killing them. Central was still attempting to talk to the male into lying the gun down and coming out of the house, but was continuing to refuse. So if you think about this from the police's perspective, Like, they get an anonymous tip that a man has murdered his wife with an AR-15 rifle, is high on drugs, and is threatening to kill others because his mental state is such that I guess he thought it was a smart idea to call the cops. He wants to go out in a blaze of glory. And so the cops, even if they smell like this is BS, like this isn't something we need to take seriously, like the alternative is that they don't take it seriously, and then there is a situation that escalates. And so on the cop side, they have to assume this is a legitimate tip, because the downside of not assuming it's legitimate is that something tragic could happen. But on the flip side, by assuming it's legitimate, something equally tragic could happen, in which, like, if cops bust into your house, like, you know, if you make the wrong move, if some guy on that SWAT team's having a bad day, like, it's not hard to imagine when things go wrong, and things have gone wrong, in which SWAT teams have thrown flashbangs into a room and permanently blinded a child. With these two in particular, Victoria, they sort of put together that they were being swatted. As they walked out, they noticed that lights were streaming into the house, and they saw reflections of rifles in their windows. And so she said, I think, is this that swatting thing? And she was smart enough to hop on the phone. They called the police and said, I don't know what you've been told, but everything is safe here, like we're fine. And they managed to get through to the police chief. They still had to go outside and send their 3 children, a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 7-year-old, into the basement because they weren't quite sure what was going to happen next. And so the 2 of them went outside, were told to get on the ground, were handcuffed in their pajamas in front of their neighbors. This town is so small that the town didn't even have its own SWAT team. They had to come in from the neighboring town that actually had a SWAT team. And fully embarrassed in front of their family members, their neighbors, all for just being wildly targeted for no good reason by some prankster on the internet who doesn't realize that there are potentially real-life consequences for this. And, you know, eventually they talk to the police chief, they explain the situation, and it starts to de-escalate. But once a SWAT is started, there are certain protocols that have to be taken out. And that includes the SWAT team sweeping through the house and checking all of the rooms. And so they weren't allowed to go in and get their children. They had to wait for the SWAT team to conclude their sweep. And so they had to wait while, you know, 5 men with rifles and full armor gear to go down into their basement and point those guns at those kids until the SWAT team could verify that everything was safe. And they could come out and sort of the kids don't even know what's going on. There's not enough time to even explain what had happened. And when I talked to Victoria about this, you know, obviously, like, it was really traumatic to imagine that, you know, the slip of a finger, you know, someone darting in the wrong direction could result in something really tragic happening. And she told me about how her baby was screaming, "Mommy, mommy," and of course I'm freaking handcuffed. The baby's trying to come to me. I'm handcuffed. I can't carry her. The SWAT team comes downstairs and goes, "Okay, it's clear. Everything's fine." And then they couldn't get my stupid handcuffs off. So I'm sitting there. The baby's trying to lunge at me. She's scared. She doesn't know what's going on. She has no shoes on. She keeps crying, "Mommy, shoes, I have no shoes." And so it's this really tragic situation in which, like, 2 people that are not looking for attention, were just trying to share something they liked, and they become a target, and where their digital footprint, you know, became a way in which people were able to sort of track them down in a way they never would have expected. You know, it's a bit of a unique scenario in that she had her cell phone now out there publicly, but, you know, part of what she's done now is, like, you know, get a second cell phone, like, get a number to your public one that is not associated with the stuff you do in private. And it's there to sort of illustrate that how easy it is for that domino effect to occur. And, you know, chances are none of this will happen to any of you or anyone you know, but, you know, it did happen to them. They never would have thought it would happen to them. So it is possible to happen to an average person. And even if nothing happens, it's just like having insurance or something. Like, you have insurance in case something goes wrong. And checking your privacy settings, checking where you've checked into things, like, those are just steps you take in the event that something could go wrong, something could be bad, not that something is actually going to happen. So this is actually a stream of Max, the guy from the couple. He took a couple weeks off and then decided he wasn't going to let something like that stop him from continuing to share something he enjoyed. So his wife joined him a little bit later, and they continued to stream video games pretty much anonymously, and almost nobody watches, and they're happy with that. And what's like really troubling, and the part that I have trouble explaining is sort of the why, right? Like it's sort of the psychology behind this. Like, why would someone want to do this? And you know, the best I can manage from the interviews I've conducted with folks that do this stuff or have instigated swattings is that there's no consequence, right? People don't go to jail for this. It's easy to get away with anonymously. Police departments are not equipped with ways to respond to it. They're not equipped with ways to help you through it. And the onus is on them to investigate a tip that could turn out to be legitimate. So it puts everyone in this really awkward situation in which all the power is allocated to sort of anonymous internet thugs that they hold the power because they are anonymous, and we choose to release our stuff publicly, and that stuff can then be used against us in a way that can escalate extremely quickly. So I mean, kind of what I want to say, sort of like the takeaway from all of this is that you don't have to take all of these steps, right? It is a lot of work, it is kind of a pain, but what you want to do is just become more consciously aware of what you're leaving out there and creating barriers for people that if for some reason you think someone might be looking for information, the more barriers you can create, the less likely they're A, going to be able to get it, and B, if it's at all difficult to do it, they might just decide not to. So the kind of classic example of this is the club, which was something that was popular in like the 80s and 90s as a way of protecting your car from thieves, but it's not hard to take the club off of a car. It's actually a really poor anti-theft mechanism. But when you're walking down the street, and it's the same reason people use like beware of dog signs, right? Like the dog doesn't have to be there, but if you see two houses, one says beware of dog, one doesn't. If you see two cars, one has a club on the steering wheel and one doesn't, like chances are you're going to target the one that's easier, that you can know there's not going to be a dog and you know that there's no club on it. And so when going through sort of your internet information and realizing what you've left out there and trying to take as much of that down or as much as you feel comfortable with, that's what you're doing, is you're just creating barriers in the instance that for some reason if someone wanted to look up that information, maybe that's a pain in the ass for them and they don't actually want to do it. And then they kind of either point it elsewhere or just don't have an interest in it at all. So, I mean, you can't guarantee anything. I think, sort of the conclusion I have come to reporting all of this stuff and, kind of dealing with it in my own life is that there's only so much you can do, but that it is incumbent on all of us to take a closer look at it because I didn't until, I had started getting alerts from, my bank account saying, like, someone's trying to reset your password. And it's like, that's some person trying to use some piece of information I left out there or a leaked password that came out through something that was no fault of my own and trying to get into my information, to my accounts, and trying to wreak havoc on my life. So, if you take away anything from this, just to be slightly more conscious about what you're leaving out there. Hopefully nothing will happen to any of you, and it probably won't, but I don't think it would hurt to be a little more aware of what is out there because I think you might be surprised at what you've left behind. So, thank you much for your time. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to field some now. If anyone has any questions, just raise your hand.
Do you think that Twitch streamers should get to a point where they're recording their content before they put it out there to protect themselves from swatting? Is that something that people are engaging in? Is there something you can help prevent that? Because I've seen so many people who got issues. The guy who was streaming RuneScape a while ago, who was a U.S. Marine, who they came to his house, and just how crazy that got for him. Is there anything to protect yourself from this? Or?
So he's representing a service called Twitch, which is a popular internet service that people use to stream out the games they're playing. It makes it very easy to do that. And he's speaking of an instance in which a guy was raising money for charity playing this game called RuneScape, and he was swatted, and it was like really terrifying for him. He was like crying on camera while it was happening because he had like a small child nearby that he couldn't get to because the police had him on the ground. He was, not being arrested, but being confined for a period of time. And to your question about, what you can do, yes, there are folks that like pre-record their stuff and put it up on YouTube as a way of like sort of disengaging from a live action. But I think what the next step is getting Congress to take this seriously. It's getting law enforcement to take this seriously. The folks I've talked to that have engaged in some of this nefarious activity these are largely folks that have outgrown it or don't do it anymore. And they say, you know, if just a couple of people went to jail, people would stop doing it. And so I think it's incumbent on more internet education, you know, educating both, you know, from our end about what we put out there, and then from the other end about law enforcement in terms of, you know, them just understanding these are things that can't happen, and then, you know, giving, you know, law enforcement the tools and the budgets to, you know, investigate these things, you know, because they've got a lot going on already. Like then trying to track down some random dude on the internet seems like less of a priority, but you know, over time that's going to become more and more prevalent. And so I think, you know, it's incumbent on a lot of ends to try and find ways that if just a couple of people were deterred from doing it, you know, if you saw someone go to jail for swatting, you might think twice about doing it. But if no one goes to jail for swatting, like, what's the harm? And then you get to be the one that laughs about it if you somehow find that humorous. So I think there's a lot of ways to address it, and it's kind of a slow road, but you know, it's part of the reason why I try and do stuff like this, is to try and just give people a better sense of kind of what is out there and some of the consequences. So.
How do you think the news and news covering sites are doing to talk about the seriousness of stuff like Gamergate and swatting? I was watching some of the coverage of one guy who got caught doing swatting, and they were very like heavy on, don't do it, it's stupid, that kind of thing. So how do you think other news sites should respond and how they are responding?
I mean, it's one of the things that I hear from folks, one of the criticisms for talking about this stuff, for sort of disclosing the tactics that people use, like talking about a website like Symposium. It's like, well, should you be talking about that stuff publicly, because isn't that just going to give people more tools to engage in this type of behavior? But what I found is that most people don't know that this stuff exists, and that if you want to find out people's information, if you want to find these websites, you literally, all you have to do is do a Google search for how to dox someone, and there are just whole documents that outline very specifically what to look for, how to pull data off of photographs that is supposed to be private location data, but that isn't necessarily erased by every application. Like, it's not hard to find this stuff for the people that want to use it for nefarious reasons. So I take the position that it's more important to be informed about what's out there, and trying to inform the public in a way that allows them to be empowered in the way that the people doing some of this negative stuff already are empowered. They already have the power and the tools, so I feel like more people should become aware of like what they're actually using to accomplish that. You know, in terms of like, you know, Gamergate and things like that, I think it is, you know, up to the media to speak loudly about topics like this, to you know, call them for what they are, and to point out these harassment tactics, because there's kind of like one of the more common phrases that people use about like online harassment and things like that is like, don't feed the trolls. It's kind of like it's like, if you just ignore the stuff that's happening, then it'll just go away. And that has not been the case for me. That has not been the case for a lot of other people that experience things like this. And I often find that to be a form of victim blaming, in which the person who is being harassed is being told like, well, if you're just quiet about it, like, it'll just stop. And that seems unfair. It seems much more fair that the person who's doing the harassing, the person who is instigating this behavior, the onus should be on them. Like, they're the ones causing the problem. I think telling people to be quiet, folks that are experiencing it, that doesn't seem quite fair.
Your answer just said kind of about something else. You mentioned not wanting to engage in victim blaming efforts. No one, but I wonder if you think that still applies, because I remember the website called Romney. I wonder how you parse out the difference between taking responsibility for what information we put out and the responsibility that we simply place on the perpetrators.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, like, Please Rob Me, like, specifically is a website that has, like, you go to it, and then it's got, like, you know, a cartoon image, and it's, like, it's very specific about pointing out, like, sort of what its intent is, which is, like, it's meant to shock you, to hopefully get you to realize what exactly, you know, sort of precautions you could be taking, or things you may not realize that you're actually doing that could allow someone to do something really terrible. So I think there's a fine line, right? Like, I think, talking about this stuff is important. You can talk about it too much, right? Like, I think it's all in sort of moderation. But, you know, I always erred on the side of trying to disclose as much as possible in a way of, you know, like I mentioned before, trying to empower people. Just because the folks that can use this for reasons that can hurt other people, like, they spend their plenty of time talking about this, coming up with tactics, and figuring out how to effectively do it. And I don't think we spend as much time sort of educating ourselves on how we can find ourselves at the center of that. And so You know, I spend a lot of time thinking about that, but I think if everyone just spent a little time thinking about that, I think it would sort of benefit all of us.
So, with not feeding the trolls, with Gamergate, it was originally about ethics in game journalism and then females in video games. And because all this stuff started happening, that focus switched away to look how terrible this vocal minority is doing to these people. And so the actual issue was lost because we fed the trolls, because we focused on, hey, stop doing this, and just made more people do it. At what, like, where's the balance at where you want to focus on the issue, but at the same time protect these people?
I mean, like I said, you know, all that stuff is a balance, and you know, there is a point to be made that, you know, when you openly talk about harassment, it does usually beget more harassment. But I disagree with the logic that just because discussing it creates more of it, we should be quiet about it. Because I think that does institute sort of this victim blaming policy in which people that are harassed, people that experience harassment, it's somehow their fault. When the blame really should be on the person or the persons instigating that, and you know, specifically to Gamergate and how that maybe obfuscated some things that people wanted to talk about. That's true, but you know, it's also impossible to ignore that the harassment and the disclosure of home addresses of women was a part of that movement. You know, however many people that was, however many people were involved in it, it certainly was a part of that, and pretending it wasn't, I think, would be a disservice to the folks who were directly affected about that, who had to leave their homes as a result. So it is all a balancing effort, and you know, we get it right and we get it wrong, and I think, you know, the worst part is we know it'll happen again, and I think it's just to try and take lessons from it, and what are the best ways that we can sort of, you know, serve all audiences, you know, going forward.
I actually just want to make a comment in relation to that. I made a point to never ever even use the words Gamergate on my public Twitter.
Sure.
And someone on Reddit compiled a list of thousands of Twitter handles called the SJW block list. Social Justice Warrior block list. I was on it, and I've never even talked about it. I must have like talked about something feminist related.
Yeah.
And landed on there, but it's expanded to just.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing about Gamergate is a name for something that I've seen for a long time, which is essentially a rejection of sort of progressive politics in video games and discussing the sort of dislocation of power from who've had previous cultural control of video games. You know, the demographic for video games for the longest time has been, you know, like 18 to 24 white males, and that's what games have been made for. That's what games have been profited on, and you know, what's happening is that, like, you know, we're seeing a shift in demographics and interest in who likes video games and who wants to see themselves in video games. And in having wider representation and having acknowledging that, it does mean that the previous demographic gets a little less interest, and that has created some hostility. But you know, it's also, you know, the argument for diversity and increased equality is also profitable. I think we're going to see that actually it's not just socially interesting, but you know, look at other forms of media. In comics, for example, so the best-selling comics, most of the best-selling comics feature female superheroes. Fast and Furious 7 just made, you know, $1 gazillion, and 75% of the audience was non-white. And so I think what you're seeing is that capitalism has served a certain demographic, and that when capitalism starts to shift its who it's serving, that creates a hostility. And like, I understand that from the perspective of people who have played those games before, and it's cool when all the games are made for you, but that's kind of shifting, and we're seeing that happen in movies and books and comic books, and I think we're going to see that happen in games. But you know, it will be an aggressive road there, and I think it's too bad that you find yourself, you know, on Reddit on a list like that for maybe just one time saying something vaguely feminist, and then suddenly you're categorized as a certain type of person, because that's not unfair. You know, you can have an opinion on one thing, and that doesn't define everything that you believe or say. And not only that, you know, that often when that happens to folks, it makes them not want to say stuff in the future, and that's when we lose, you know, voices that want to speak out because they feel a mild bit of hostility, and it's not worth it to continue speaking out. That's really unfortunate, because we lose a lot of interesting voices in the process. Cool. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate your time, and thanks for having me at Belmont. And yeah, everyone take care. Have a good day.